From empty streets to crowded crosswalks, a journey through the changing heart of our city, where every corner holds a story, every face a memory, and the pulse of life beats louder than ever before in a place that's both comfortingly familiar and unpredictably new. I still remember the day I first walked down Maple Street in 1985, my hand gripping my grandmother's weathered fingers as she pointed out every shop, every neighbor, every story that made up the fabric of what she called our little corner of the world. Back then, Riverside was the kind of place where you knew everyone's name, where Mrs. Patterson at the corner grocery could tell your mother exactly what candy you'd bought with your allowance, and where the biggest excitement was the annual Founders Day parade that brought all 300 residents to Main Street. The buildings were old even then. Red brick storefronts with hand-painted signs, narrow sidewalks cracked by decades of frost and thaw, streetlights that cast amber pools in the early evening. It was a place that seemed frozen in time, resistant to the changes sweeping through the bigger cities just an hour's drive away. "Remember this," Grandma Rose would say as we walked past Henderson's Hardware, where Mr. Henderson still used a manual cash register and kept bolts and screws in glass jars labeled with masking tape. "Remember how it feels to belong somewhere." I thought I understood what she meant. Riverside was home, unchanging, predictable, safe. The kind of place where your biggest worry was whether the high school football team would finally beat their rivals from Millbrook, and where the most controversial topic at town meetings was whether to install a second stop sign at the elementary school. But I was 16 and dreaming of bigger things. Cities with skyscrapers and subway systems, places where you could get Thai food at midnight and see movies that weren't 6 months old. Riverside felt like a cage, beautiful maybe, but confining. "I'm going to live in a real city someday," I told Grandma Rose as we sat on her front porch that last summer before I left for college. "Somewhere exciting, somewhere things actually happen." She smiled and patted my hand. "Things happen everywhere, sweetheart. You just have to know how to see them." I thought she was being nostalgic, clinging to a past that the world had moved beyond. So I left for college in Chicago, then graduated to a job in New York, then eventually settled in San Francisco, building a life among millions of strangers in cities that never slept. For 25 years, I lived exactly the life I'd dreamed of at 16. I had a corner office with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge, the apartment in Pacific Heights, and access to restaurants, theaters, and museums that would have seemed impossible from the perspective of small-town Riverside. I came back for holidays and funerals, staying just long enough to feel both homesick and claustrophobic before returning to what I thought of as my real life. But cities change you in ways you don't expect. The excitement I'd craved became exhausting. The anonymity I'd treasured became loneliness. The endless possibilities became overwhelming choices that somehow led to the same routine: work, commute, sleep, repeat. When the tech company I'd spent 15 years building was acquired, and I found myself 43 with enough money to retire early, but no idea what I actually wanted to do with my freedom, I made a decision that would have shocked my 16-year-old self. I came home to Riverside. The drive from the airport took me through familiar countryside, but as I approached the town limits, I started noticing changes. A new subdivision where the Morrison farm used to be. A Starbucks where Patterson's grocery had stood for 60 years. Street signs that looked too clean, too modern for the Riverside I remembered. When I turned onto Maple Street, I barely recognized it. The narrow sidewalks had been widened and lined with young trees that hadn't yet developed character. The old streetlights had been replaced with modern LED fixtures that cast harsh white light instead of the warm amber glow I remembered. And the shops were completely different. Henderson's Hardware was now artisan coffee and books, with floor-to-ceiling windows and customers typing on laptops at rustic wooden tables. The old Riverside diner had become farm-to-table bistro, with a line of people waiting for weekend brunch. Even the barbershop where I'd gotten my first haircut was now a boutique selling what the window sign called curated vintage home goods. I drove slowly, trying to reconcile my memories with this new reality. It was still Riverside. The basic street layout was the same. The tree-lined neighborhood still spread out in familiar patterns, but it felt like someone had taken my hometown and dressed it up for a magazine photo shoot. The house I'd inherited from Grandma Rose sat at the end of Maple Street, unchanged except for some necessary repairs and a coat of paint. But as I sat on the front porch that first evening, watching strangers walk dogs down sidewalks I'd known since childhood, I felt like an alien who'd landed in a place that looked like home but wasn't quite. The next morning, I decided to walk downtown and reacquaint myself with whatever Riverside had become. The coffee shop that had replaced Henderson's Hardware was busy with a crowd I didn't recognize. Young parents with strollers, people in expensive exercise clothes, workers in flannel shirts and artfully distressed jeans who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine about rural chic. I ordered a latte that cost more than my grandmother used to spend on groceries for a week and sat by the window, watching the street I'd grown up on transform before my eyes. "You look confused," said a voice behind me. I turned to see a woman about my age with paint-stained fingers and a knowing smile. "New to town?" "Actually," I said, "I grew up here, just moved back after 25 years away." Her eyebrows shot up. "Oh, wow. That must be quite a shock. I'm Maya Chen. I moved here about 5 years ago from Portland. The changes have been pretty dramatic even in that time." "I'm Sam Morrison. My grandmother was Rose Morrison. She lived on this street for 60 years. "Rose Morrison! I heard about her from some of the longtime residents. She sounds like she was an amazing woman. Did you know there's a community garden named after her?" I didn't know that. In fact, I was realizing there were a lot of things I didn't know about what had happened to my hometown in the decades I'd been gone. "Would you like me to give you the unofficial tour?" Maya asked. "I run the local historical society now. Well, it's more like historical preservation meets community planning. I could show you what's changed and what stayed the same." I spent the next 2 hours getting reacquainted with Riverside through Maya's eyes. She showed me how the old Carnegie Library had been expanded and transformed into a community center that hosted everything from yoga classes to town meetings to art exhibitions. The building where my father had worked at the grain elevator was now a farmer's market pavilion, bustling with vendors selling organic produce and handmade crafts. "What happened?" I asked as we walked past a block of Victorian houses that had been meticulously restored. "When I left, this place was dying. Half the young people moved away after graduation, the main street was full of empty storefronts, and everyone was talking about whether the town would even exist in another generation." Maya nodded. "It was touch and go for a while, but around 2010, a few things converged. The county got some federal grants for rural development. Housing prices in the city started pushing people to look for alternatives, and a group of residents, led by your grandmother actually, started a campaign to preserve what was special about Riverside while making it viable for the future. Grandma Rose was involved in development planning. She was the driving force behind most of it. She had this vision of a place that could honor its history while adapting to change. The community garden, the farmer's market, the restored downtown, a lot of it started with ideas she proposed at town meetings. We stopped in front of what used to be an empty lot behind the post office. Now it was a small park with benches, flower beds, and a plaque that read, "Rose Morrison Memorial Garden, a place where the past and future bloom together." Once I sat down on one of the benches, overwhelmed by the realization that my grandmother had been working to transform Riverside, while I was dismissing it as a place where nothing important happened. "She talked about you," Maya said gently. "At town meetings, in interviews for the local paper. She was so proud of your success, but she always said she hoped you'd come back someday and see what the town could become. I thought she wanted everything to stay exactly the same. I think what she wanted was for the town to stay true to its values while finding new ways to thrive. Change that honored the past instead of erasing it." Over the following weeks, I began to understand what Maya meant. Yes, Riverside had changed dramatically, but the more time I spent exploring, the more I could see the threads connecting the old town to the new one. The coffee shop that had replaced Henderson's Hardware still served as a community gathering place where neighbors caught up on local news. The owners had even preserved the original pressed tin ceiling and incorporated some of Mr. Henderson's old fixtures into the decor. The farm-to-table bistro was run by the Kowalski family, whose grandparents had operated the old diner. They were serving locally sourced food just like their predecessors had, but with a modern understanding of nutrition and sustainability. Even the boutique in the old barbershop was owned by Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter, who had curated a collection of goods made by local artisans and regional craftspeople. The changes weren't random or imposed from outside. They were organic adaptations that preserved the essential character of Riverside while making it relevant to contemporary life. But the real revelation came when I started attending town meetings. I'd expected these to be contentious affairs, with longtime residents battling newcomers over the soul of the community. Instead, I found something remarkable. A genuine collaboration between people who'd lived in Riverside for generations and people who'd chosen it as their new home. "The key," explained Frank Rodriguez, who'd grown up on the same street as my father and now served as mayor, "is that we didn't just accept change or fight it. We decided to direct it." The town had developed what they called growth guidelines. that required new businesses and developments to contribute to the community rather than just extract profit from it. The Starbucks that had replaced Patterson's Grocery, for example, had been required to maintain a community bulletin board and host local events. The new subdivisions included affordable housing and preserved green space. Your grandmother taught us that, Frank continued. She said that if we were going to change anyway, we might as well change in ways that made us stronger instead of weaker. I started volunteering with Maya's Historical Society, helping to document the stories of longtime residents while also recording the experiences of newcomers who were adding their own chapters to Riverside's story. That's when I met Carlos Mendoza, who'd moved from Los Angeles 5 years earlier to open a Mexican restaurant in the space that had once housed the old Five and Dime. People told me I was crazy, Carlos said as we sat in his restaurant, which was packed with a diverse crowd enjoying what had become the best food in 3 counties. They said a place like Riverside wouldn't accept authentic Mexican cuisine. But you know what I found? They were hungry for it. Not just the food, but the culture, the celebration, the sense of community that comes with sharing meals. Carlos had faced some initial skepticism, but he'd won people over by participating in community events, sourcing ingredients from local farms, and hiring local workers. His Day of the Dead celebration had become an annual town tradition, and his restaurant served as an unofficial community center where people from different backgrounds gathered to share food and stories. The thing about small towns, Carlos told me, is that they can be incredibly welcoming once they understand that you're here to contribute, not just to take advantage of lower costs. I heard similar stories from other newcomers, the young couple who'd opened an organic farm on land that had been sitting idle, the artist who'd converted an old warehouse into studios that she rented to other creatives, the tech worker who'd moved from Seattle and started a co-working space for people who wanted to work remotely while living in a community. Each new resident had brought skills, ideas, and energy that had revitalized different aspects of town life. But they'd also adopted traditions, supported existing businesses, and learned from people who'd been part of the community for decades. It's not gentrification, Maya explained when I asked about the balance between preservation and change. Gentrification pushes out existing residents and replaces them with wealthier newcomers. What's happening here is more like collaborative evolution. People are working together to create something that serves everyone. The proof was in the numbers. Riverside's population had grown from 300 to nearly 2,000, but property taxes had been structured to ensure that longtime residents weren't priced out of their homes. The main street had gone from 50% vacancy to full occupancy, but the new businesses were required to maintain the architectural character of the historic district. Most importantly, the community had retained its sense of identity while expanding its definition of who belonged. I saw this most clearly during the annual Founders Day parade, which I attended for the first time in 15 years. The parade still featured the high school marching band, the volunteer fire department, and the 4-H club with their livestock. But it also included Carlos's restaurant float celebrating Dia de los Muertos, a group of refugee families who'd been resettled in Riverside through a church sponsorship program, and Maya's Historical Society driving a restored 1940s farm truck while dressed in period costumes. The diversity was remarkable, but what struck me most was how natural it felt. The different groups weren't just tolerating each other. They were celebrating together, creating new traditions that honored both continuity and change. Standing on Maple Street watching the parade, I finally understood what Grandma Rose had meant about belonging somewhere. It wasn't about everything staying exactly the same. It was about being part of a community that could adapt and grow while maintaining its essential character. After the parade, I found myself in conversation with Jenny Patterson, whose grandmother had run the old grocery store. I was angry at first, she admitted. When the Starbucks came in, it felt like they were erasing our history. But then I realized that if we wanted local businesses to survive, we needed customers who could afford to shop here. The newcomers brought money and energy that kept other local businesses alive. She pointed to the hardware store that had opened in a new location after Mr. Henderson retired. Tom Henderson's grandson runs it now, and he's doing better business than his grandfather ever did. The new residents are buying tools for home renovation projects, gardening supplies for their organic gardens, and materials for art projects. They're not trying to turn Riverside into something it's not. They're helping it become a better version of what it always was. That evening, I walked the length of Maple Street again, but this time I wasn't mourning what had been lost. Instead, I was marveling at what had been gained. The street was alive in a way I'd never seen it before. Families were walking to dinner at Carlos's restaurant. Teenagers were gathering at the coffee shop to work on homework and socialize. Elderly residents were sitting on porches, waving to neighbors who represented a beautiful mix of longtime locals and recent arrivals. The buildings were different, yes, but the spirit of community that Grandma Rose had tried to preserve was stronger than ever. I made a decision that night. Instead of just visiting Riverside, I was going to stay. Not because I was running away from city life, but because I wanted to be part of what the town was becoming. Using skills I'd developed in my corporate career, I started a nonprofit organization focused on rural community development. We worked with other small towns that were facing similar challenges, helping them find ways to grow sustainably while preserving what made them special. The office was in the restored Carnegie Library, and my first project was documenting the lessons Riverside had learned about managing growth and change. The case study we developed became a model for other communities throughout the region. But the most meaningful part of my new life wasn't the work. It was the daily experience of living in a place where I knew my neighbors, where my contributions mattered, and where I could see the direct impact of community involvement. 2 years after moving back, I was elected to the town council. 5 years later, I helped establish sister city relationships with communities in Mexico and Vietnam, reflecting the diversity of families who'd made Riverside their home. 10 years after my return, Maya and I were married in the Rose Morrison Memorial Garden, surrounded by friends who represented the full spectrum of Riverside's evolution, from families who'd lived here for generations to recent arrivals who'd been drawn by the community's reputation for inclusive growth. Today, as I write this, Riverside is home to nearly 4,000 people. We have a small liberal arts college that attracts students from around the world. Main Street bustles with activity every day of the week. The farmers market draws visitors from 5 counties, and our annual festivals celebrate everything from apple harvest to cultural diversity to local innovation. But we've also preserved the essence of what made this place special. Children still ride bikes on quiet residential streets. Neighbors still help each other during difficult times. Town meetings still feature spirited but respectful debates about the community's future. Most importantly, we've learned that the choice isn't between staying the same or changing completely. The choice is between changing thoughtfully or changing accidentally, between evolution and revolution, between growth that strengthens community and growth that destroys it. The secret, I've come to understand, is remembering that places are made up of people, and people are endlessly capable of adaptation when they work together toward shared goals. Riverside today looks very different from the town I left in 1985. The empty streets are now crowded crosswalks. The quiet main street is now a bustling center of commerce and culture. The homogeneous population is now beautifully diverse. But in all the ways that matter, it's still the same place where Grandma Rose taught me about belonging. It's still a community where every corner holds a story, where every face carries memory, and where the pulse of life beats strong. The difference is that now I understand what she was trying to tell me about things happening everywhere, if you know how to see them. Change isn't something that happens to a place. It's something that happens through people who care enough to guide it. From my office window, I can see Maya teaching a group of children about local history in the memorial garden. I can see Carlos setting up tables for his lunch crowd. I can see Tom Henderson Jr. helping a customer load lumber for a home improvement project. I can see a place that's both comfortingly familiar and unpredictably new, where the past and future really do bloom together. And I can see why Grandma Rose never stopped believing that the most important changes happen not in the biggest cities, but in the smallest communities, where individual choices and collective dreams can still transform the world, one neighbor at a time. This is Riverside today, a testament to the possibility that growth and preservation, tradition and innovation, continuity and change can coexist when people choose to build bridges instead of walls. From empty streets to crowded crosswalks, it's been quite a journey. But the best part is that the journey continues, written by every person who chooses to call this place home and work to make it better for everyone who comes after. The heart of our city beats louder than ever, and every beat tells a story of what becomes possible when communities dare to imagine their best future and work together to create it.